We found ourselves caught in yet another argument, one of those familiar recurring fights that had become all too common. It started with something trivial, as most arguments do. I had suggested we spend the evening together, hoping to be considerate by offering to set aside my work and distractions for the night. But instead of gratitude, her response was sharp, cold, and dismissive. "I don't owe you intimacy." Her arms were crossed, her gaze challenging, as if daring me to push back. For a moment, I stood there, dumbfounded, unsure if I had heard her right. "What does that even mean?" I asked, half laughing in disbelief. "It means exactly what it sounds like," she retorted, her voice cutting through the tension. "Just because we're married doesn't mean I owe you anything." Those words hit me like a blow to the chest, the sting far deeper than I had anticipated. We had been married for 8 years, years that had been filled with late nights, sacrifices, and endless efforts to build a life together. Yet, in one swift blow, she had dismissed everything: trust, intimacy, and partnership. The foundation of our relationship felt suddenly fragile, as if the ground beneath us had crumbled without warning. I stood there, frozen, staring at her, feeling like I was facing a stranger. The woman I had known for nearly a decade felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone whose words cut through me. The argument didn't last long. She walked out, leaving me alone with the heaviness of her words, my mind spiraling as I replayed the conversation over and over. At first, I tried to rationalize her behavior, telling myself she was just stressed or having a bad day. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just a one-off comment. It wasn't even the first time she'd made me feel insignificant. This was simply the first time she had spoken the truth so plainly. That night, I barely slept. The words, "I don't owe you intimacy," echoed in my mind, over and over. I began questioning everything. Had I missed the signs? Had I pushed her away? Or had I been blind to what was really happening all along? By morning, my sadness had transformed into something sharper, a resolve. If she didn't owe me intimacy, then maybe I didn't owe her anything either. I started to step back, to withdraw. I stopped making the effort, the endless sacrifices that had once felt like a natural part of our relationship. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I began to observe her, paying closer attention to how she treated me, how she had slowly become dismissive, indifferent. Her tone had shifted. The gestures that once felt like signs of affection were now met with coldness or disinterest. I'd made her favorite dinner after a long week at work, only to be met with a lukewarm, barely there thanks before she walked off. I stayed up late listening to her vent about her day, sacrificing my own rest, but it felt like nothing, just a hollow routine, as if I was invisible to her. The intimacy I had once cherished, more than just physical, but about connection, mutual respect, and being valued, seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a relationship that was more like two people living parallel lives than a partnership. I began to pull back, not out of spite but out of self-preservation. I stopped initiating conversations, stopped going out of my way to make her feel loved, to make her life easier. She didn't seem to notice, or maybe she didn't care. Either way, I began to understand. Our marriage had become a one-sided effort, and I was tired of being the only one holding it together. I stopped filling the silence between us. For once, I let it hang there, unspoken. At first, she didn't seem to notice. She was so used to me being the one to keep things alive that my withdrawal blended into the background. But after a while, something shifted. I could see her becoming uneasy, uncomfortable in the quiet that had once been filled with my effort. She started making small comments. "You've been quiet lately," or "Is everything okay?" I didn't respond, shrugging them off. I wasn't going to let her twist the narrative or put the blame on me. Not after everything. The silence between us grew, and her reactions became sharper. Petty complaints about things like how I folded the laundry or about the gas tank not being filled. She even accused me of being distracted during conversations we weren't even having. But I didn't take the bait. I didn't engage. Then came her attempts to smooth things over, small, subtle gestures at first. She placed a coffee next to me while I was working late, or suggested watching a movie, something we used to do often. But I didn't jump at these crumbs of attention. I didn't want to reward her efforts without addressing the deeper issues between us. I needed to see if these gestures were genuine or just another attempt to cover up the cracks in our relationship. One evening, after days of silence, she finally asked, her voice quieter than usual, "Are you mad at me?" I looked her in the eye and, for the first time in ages, said what I had been holding back. I'm just done trying harder than you. The words hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth, ready to defend herself, but this time, nothing came out. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was losing. I wasn't angry, I wasn't sad, I was just done. Done apologizing for wanting more than she was willing to give. The next morning, the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. She was quieter, uneasy, but still waiting for me to break. She didn't have to wait long for me to confirm that nothing had changed. I went about my day as usual, coffee, emails, work, without a glance in her direction. That's when the texts began. We need to talk. I ignored them. Seriously, we can't just act like this isn't happening. Unread. By the time I got home, she was pacing, rehearsing what I assumed was her speech. But when she tried to start, I stopped her cold. What do you want? I asked, my voice flat as I dropped my keys on the counter. She snapped, her voice edged with disbelief. What do I want? You're the one acting like a stranger in our own house. I want to know what's going on with you. I couldn't help but laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was almost absurd. What's going on with me? I echoed, disbelief clear in my voice. I'm just following your lead. You made it perfectly clear what this marriage is, and isn't the night you said you didn't owe me intimacy. Her face flushed, and I half expected her to deny it. But instead, she went on the defensive, her voice sharp. I'm allowed to set boundaries. If you can't handle that, maybe that's your problem, not mine. I swallowed my anger, keeping my voice steady. I wasn't about to let her turn this back on me. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing my ground. Dive into a new one. David sat quietly in the expansive living room, his chair positioned at the far end of the long mahogany table, his hands rested on its cool surface, his mind heavy with thoughts. He had just returned from a grueling day at the architecture firm where he had stayed late to finalize intricate designs for a luxury hotel in New York. The workload itself didn't faze him, it was something he'd grown accustomed to, but an unsettling weight had followed him home over the past few weeks, making the air feel heavier with every passing day. He glanced at the clock. 10:30 p.m. Emma was late again. Emma, his wife of 6 years, usually called or texted when she was running behind. Her messages, always sweet and endearing, would brighten his evenings. I can't wait to see you tonight. But recently her communication had dwindled to sporadic updates, and her reasons for being late felt forced, like lines rehearsed for a performance. David brushed off the jealousy creeping into his thoughts. He'd always prided himself on being trusting and rational, but tonight there was no denying the signs. Emma had been dressing up more often, choosing outfits and perfumes she reserved for their dates. She checked her phone frequently, her expression softening as she read messages she didn't share with him. The door creaked open, breaking his train of thought. Emma stepped inside, her high heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Her makeup was flawless, her hair carefully styled, and she wore the green dress David had always admired, but tonight it wasn't for him. Hey, she greeted nonchalantly, tossing her keys onto the tray by the door. Long day at work. We had a client breathing down our necks, so we had to get everything wrapped up tonight. David forced a smile, but his chest tightened as a faint, unfamiliar cologne lingered in the air. Another late night, huh? He said, his tone light but edged with curiosity. Emma shrugged, avoiding his gaze. You know how it is. He wanted to push further, but her detached demeanor held him back. David had never been the type to interrogate, and he didn't want to become the jealous husband he'd always sworn he wouldn't be. But this felt different. The distance between them wasn't just in her words, it was in her touch, her smile, and her absence even when she was near. Rising from his seat, David crossed the room to face her. Emma, he began softly, you've been working late a lot lately. For a moment she froze, her lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead her gaze dropped to the floor, her face painted with guilt, and just like that, David's worst fears were confirmed. The ache in his chest was overwhelming, part relief that he wasn't imagining the shift between them, part devastation that the woman he loved had betrayed his trust. How long, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma hesitated before answering, her voice trembling. A few months. David inhaled sharply, his fists clenching at his sides. So Ryan, he said bitterly, he reached out, and you just let everything we built go. It wasn't like that, Emma said, tears streaming down her face. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. It just did. David's laugh was hollow, devoid of warmth. Things like this don't just happen, Emma. You made a choice, and now we both have to live with it. The days that followed were a blur. Emma moved out, taking only the essentials. Their once vibrant home now echoed with silence, every corner a painful reminder of what had been. Despite the anguish, David knew he had to move forward. Rebuilding his life wouldn't be easy, but staying in the shadow of her betrayal was not an option. Meanwhile, Emma moved in with Ryan. Mutual friends told David they seemed happy, as that their affair had blossomed into a fairy tale. They were planning a wedding, a future that David once thought was his. The pain was unbearable, but he focused on healing, slowly piecing himself back together. Then, a month later, something unexpected happened. David's phone rang, breaking the quiet evening. He hesitated before answering. Hello. On the other end, Emma's voice trembled. David, I need to talk to you. His chest tightened. He hadn't spoken to her since the day she left. He had tried to bury the memories and focus on himself, but the desperation in her voice held him in place. What is it, Emma? He asked cautiously. It's Ryan, she said, her voice shaky. He canceled the wedding. David blinked, struggling to process her words. What? Emma let out a shaky breath. He called everything off, he said. He thinks we made a mistake. Emma finished, her voice barely audible. David sat in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. He felt a mix of emotions, confusion, anger, and a flicker of something he didn't want to name. What do you want me to say, Emma? He asked, finally, his tone steady but cold. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know who else to talk to. David clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to lash out. She left me, she chose someone else, and now she wants me to be her comfort. Emma, he said, exhaling slowly, you made your choice. You left. I'm not sure what you're expecting from me. I'm not asking for anything, she said quickly. She paused, her voice trembling again. I feel like I've lost everything. I don't know where to go from here. David stared at the floor, his thoughts racing. Part of him wanted to shut her out completely, to hang up and continue building his life without the ghost of her betrayal haunting him, but another part, the part that still remembered the love they had shared, hesitated. You'll figure it out, he said at last, his voice firm but not unkind, just like I had to. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment David thought she had hung up. Then he heard her soft sobs. I'm sorry, Emma whispered, for everything. I didn't realize what I had until I lost it. David closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. He didn't respond. Apologies couldn't undo the damage, and he wasn't ready to forgive. Take care of yourself, Emma, he said finally. Goodbye. He ended the call before she could respond, his heart heavy but resolute as he sat there. The quiet of the room seemed less oppressive than it had before. For the first time in weeks, David felt a sense of closure. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew this was his chance to truly move on. Emma's chapter in his life was over, and it was time to start writing a new one, this time on his own terms.